My name is Stanley St. Rose, and today we're going to be talking about the novel The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, written by Robert Louis Stevenson. Before I go into the summary and explanation of this novel, please remember to leave a like, subscribe, and or leave a comment. So, this novel really follows Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. They are the same being. Dr. Jekyll created a serum where when he drinks it, he turns into Mr. Hyde. And throughout the novel, he kind of loses control of his transformation and he starts to change into Mr. Hyde at different points when he goes to sleep and even during the day. Mr. Hyde is not a pleasant person to be around. Within the novel, he tramples over this little girl and he kills a man by the name of Sir Danvers Carew. And it's a vicious killing. It's a killing where, in the scene that he kills Sir Danvers Carew, we are told that Sir Danvers Carew's body was jumping up and down from the sidewalk from the pressure and the heaviness of the blows that Mr. Hyde was delivering to his body long after he was already dead. Mr. Hyde kills without any passion, he just kills just because. He gets a pleasure from killing people for no reason. Sir Danvers Carew had no issue with Mr. Hyde. He had no issues with anybody. He's described to be a gentleman and a person that everybody gets along with. In the scene that Mr. Hyde kills Sir Danvers Carew, it just comes out of nowhere, and he just has a cane and he just starts hitting and clubbing Sir Danvers Carew to the ground. So in the novel, several things arise that um, make Mr. Utterson a little bit suspicious about the relationship between Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The first thing is the will that Dr. Jekyll had. Within the will, Dr. Jekyll had given everything that he has to Mr. Hyde upon his death. And Mr. Utterson had a problem with this because he didn't understand why Dr. Jekyll was going to give everything that he owned to Mr. Hyde when he died. So, as a lawyer, Mr. Utterson believed that somehow Hyde had a some sort of leverage on Dr. Jekyll. So in the novel, we really follow Mr. Utterson going around trying to figure out what's going on with Mr. Hyde, what's going on with Dr. Jekyll. And piece by piece, he does figure this out. He goes to Dr. Lanyon. Dr. Lanyon dies within the novel after he learns what Dr. Jekyll is doing. And the fundament of this is that Dr. Jekyll was researching and creating a way for himself to split himself into two different beings, and this revelation does end in Dr. Lanyon's death because he was so shocked and surprised when he figured out what Dr. Jekyll had done. So in the novel, later in the novel, we do figure out and we do find out little by little that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are the same people. And one thing that kind of led us to this conclusion is, first of all, Mr. Hyde's home was at the back of Dr. Jekyll's mansion. So when if you follow Mr. Hyde going to his house, he literally just went to the back of Dr. Jekyll's mansion, and that's where he lived. So that was very suspicious. The other part that really brought us to this conclusion that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are the same people is the very fact that they have the same handwriting, and when you examine their handwriting um, right next to each other, you kind of figured out that it really strongly resembles the same thing, and that really goes back to saying that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are the same people. Going back to the whole point that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde live in the same house, it's quite interesting because when Dr. Jekyll is Dr. Jekyll, he goes to the front of his house. But when he's Mr. Hyde, he goes to the back of his house. I think this is very interesting and very symbolic in many ways because, again, Mr. Hyde, from his name, of course, he is the thing that Dr. Jekyll hides. He is the parts of himself that he wants nothing to do with, the animalistic, the uncivilized, the thrills that Mr. Hyde gets from committing murders are things that you want to hide. And the very fact that Mr. Hyde enters the mansion from the back of the house says a lot about what Mr. Hyde is. He's something that should be hidden. He's something that Dr. Jekyll is not particularly proud of. That's why he doesn't walk into the front of the mansion. That's just one of the reasons. Of course, the other reason is that the servants know that they're serving Dr. Jekyll and not Mr. Hyde. So if Mr. Hyde did go through the front of the mansion, there would be problems. But in a symbolic way, it does say a lot about the different characters within this single being and what they represent. You could go as far as, or you could find evidence to show that maybe Dr. Jekyll is the good half and Mr. Hyde is the bad half. But there is some evidence in the novel to prove that idea wrong, and there is evidence within this novel to prove that idea right. So, in the novel, Mr. Utterson does figure out who is the difference between Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And in the end of the novel, what happens is Dr. Jekyll commits suicide, where Mr. Hyde and himself they both die. But the novel does make this a puzzle, and you really have to put everything together to really figure out who are these two individuals and why Dr. Jekyll decided to split himself into two different beings. This is a very popular work. There's much more to this novel. There's much more leading up to this conclusion. But the fundamental idea of this novel is how this one being, Dr. Jekyll, decided to split himself up through his research, through his scientific experiments, and what that really brought for him. He did split himself up. He got the ability to commit murders, and he had the ability to kind of like separate morals and righteousness between Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And Mr. Hyde kind of just really did what he wanted when he wanted, because he really didn't have those emotional human attachment, moral attachments. But at the same time, he was committing evil and he wasn't being checked from for it. So the novel ends with Dr. Jekyll writing another will. He gives all of his money to Mr. Utterson. So in a way, the novel does end for Mr. Utterson, because he ends up with a mansion and all of Dr. Jekyll's money, because Dr. Jekyll really didn't have, it doesn't seem that he had other family members or anybody else to give his money to. So Mr. Utterson ends up a very rich man at the end of the novel, and Dr. Jekyll ends up dead. Both half of himself end up dead. Um, so that's the result of what he did. That's the result of his experiment. Which it does beg a lot of questions about the human condition. It begs a lot of question about people, because splitting yourself up, I think every person can have a Mr. Hyde or a Mrs. Hyde of their own, but splitting them up really does not give us a good promising of anything, because I think our good halves and our bad halves keep us in check. They keep each other in check. So when you split them apart, it kind of creates this imbalance between these two beings of one being. It creates this imbalance to the point where Mr. Hyde doesn't have Dr. Jekyll's maybe moral obligations and a sense of right to guide him. So he does whatever he wants, and he gets a thrill from killing people. So Mr. Hyde had his fun, and don't there shouldn't be a misconception here, because in a sense I think Dr. Jekyll wanted to have Mr. Hyde as a card in his back pocket. If Mr. Hyde only came out at night and then started taking over his entire being, I can assume that Dr. Jekyll would have stayed how he was, because the problem that that made Dr. Jekyll come to the conclusion of committing suicide is the very fact that he was losing control of Mr. Hyde and his entire being. If Mr. Hyde decided to just stay at, to come out only at night, he would have been fine with it. But it's the very fact that Mr. Hyde started to transform and come out during the day, and when he was sleeping. So he started to lose control. He started to lose his 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 body to Mr. Hyde. And that's really the novel. Another thing that I would like to bring up within this novel is the very fact that there's no women characters within this novel. Yes, there is the little girl that is trampled, but there's no women characters of significance within this novel, which is really interesting. It's only a novel about men, and the reason why I bring this up, all of these characters, Dr. Lanyon, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Utterson, they're all men of high class. They have very rich homes and they have servants, but somehow they none of them have wives. That's a point that's quite interesting to bring up, and it's puzzling to as to why that a piece such as that is missing within this novel. The other thing that is quite strange within this novel is the scene where Mr. Hyde tramples over a little girl, and I'm pretty sure from the novel it says at 3 o'clock in the morning or at 12 o'clock. It's either or of those hours, which it's pretty late for a little girl, to be playing out in the street at the 12 or 3 o'clock hour. That is quite strange. And Mr. Hyde, yes, he tramples over her, and he keeps on walking, and yes, later he's called back to pay and to, because he ends up paying the parents of the girl. He writes a check in Jekyll's name. Jekyll eventually pays this check. But the very fact is, what is a little girl doing in the middle of the street at night playing? The 12 o'clock hour, the 3 o'clock hour, that's not really a time for a little girl to be playing in the street. Yes, her parents do come and say, why you just trample over my daughter, but the very fact is that's just a very odd hour to find a child playing in the middle of the street. So there are some strange scenes and some strange things that happen within this work, this novel. I guess that's why they call it the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. There are certainly some strange scenes of how people get killed, and weird um, weird things happen at weird times within this novel. I find that scene um, very different because it's not often where you see a child playing in the street at 3 o'clock or midnight hour. So maybe that has some sort of um, that has a meaning to its own. Because I know that the 3 o'clock hour, the 12 o'clock hour, has its own mystical or dark meaning sometimes. So that's the novel of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I hope you enjoyed my summary explanation of it. Please leave a like, subscribe, and or leave a comment. And I'll see you guys in the next video.